Welcome to the SciFeed Guest Show. I'm your host Jack, and in each episode I'll be talking to a different scientist about work that they've been doing or topics they know best. In this episode I'm talking to Amber Carter, a PhD student at the University of Edinburgh. We discuss the effects of climate change on coastal communities in developing countries, and also different projects that Amber's been involved in to help tackle that. So welcome to the show, Amber, and could you start off by telling us a bit about yourself?
Thanks, Jack. So yeah, my name's Amber, as you said, and I am, a marine scientist. I've just started about a year ago, my PhD at the University of Edinburgh, and my work focuses on the impact of climate change on coastal ecosystems. So that's mostly tropical coastal ecosystems, which includes coral reefs, mangroves, and seagrass. I think about how climate change is going to impact those ecosystems, but also how potential impacts that may happen is actually going to also impact the local coastal communities that are kind of reliant on those ecosystems for their income and for their food. There are infinite types of coastal communities. When I talk about coastal communities in particular, I'm talking about in mostly developing countries. And these communities are normally highly reliant on what we call the natural marine resources. So maybe the fish, the mangrove wood, and they're kind of highly reliant on those resources for their income and often for their food as well. So it will make up a big part of their diet.
What sort of climate change are you looking at?
There's kind of a myriad of ways that climate change is going to impact those communities. Sea level rise, because they often are living very close to the ocean. So even now, communities are kind of having to move their dwellings further and further back inland. There's things like cyclones and hurricanes. So climate change is expected not necessarily to increase the amount of cyclones, but the intensity of cyclones. And it's those kind of real intense cyclones that have lots of potential for destruction of both the villages where people are living, but also the kind of coastal ecosystems that they're relying on. And I'm working with the amazing organisation Blue Ventures, and at the moment I'm focusing at their site in southwest Madagascar. This region is called the Velondraki region. The people that kind of indigenous people that live there, they're called the Vezo people, and Vezo translate to kind of live with the sea or live by the sea. So they're naturally semi-nomadic fishing community.
I'm guessing they've lived there for generations then.
For thousands of years probably. And they were kind of the main problems for the Vezo community came, I think it was in around the late 1990s and early 2000s, perhaps a bit earlier, where basically they'd been kind of subsistence fishing and also selling to the kind of nearest cities, but all through on a kind of small scale, kind of a more of a regional scale. And the problems really came for them in the kind of 1990s and early 2000s when I think national and international fishing industry started tapping into that. And so the huge commercial boats would come and collect fish every day from these small villages in the southwest Madagascar. And that eventually basically led to a kind of near breakdown of the whole marine ecosystem. It was so overfished that, there was like not much chance for it to recover. And it was so overfished that the commercial fishing boats stopped coming because there was no more fish for them to buy. And then these communities who are kind of around 85% of the people there are kind of reliant on the marine resources for their income and for their food. They were kind of left really struggling. And so then Blue Ventures, they started working in 2003 in Madagascar, and they helped the communities to develop what they call a kind of locally managed marine protected area. They've organised their coastal area into mixed uses. There's some areas within their coastal waters that are completely no-take, so you're not allowed to fish. And there's some areas which you're only allowed to fish part of the time because that allows the fish stocks to naturally regenerate.
So the important thing is just really careful management of those stocks.
Yeah, and important thing about the locally marine managed area is, although that they often have a kind of technical support from an NGO or a government institution, is that the kind of main decisions and the overall decisions are led by the local community and the people that live there. And these locally managed marine areas, they've really increased all over the world in the last few decades, just because they've been shown to be a much better way and more effective way to manage marine ecosystems that communities are really reliant on, and this kind of top-down government-led initiatives.
Yeah, I guess it's important that the actual local people have a say and an active role in doing that.
Yeah, the work I'm doing in Madagascar and with the communities is that a question that they are kind of facing is, okay, how is climate change going to impact us, and how can we best prepare for that? Before they know and before we know how to help them prepare and adapt for climate change, we need to understand how climate change is going to impact them. And we also need to understand what part of their society, what part of this kind of social ecological system that they live within, what part's vulnerable to these impacts of climate change. And so the work that I'm doing is that I'm using lots of data, all types of data, from social surveys within the local community, from coral surveys that have been done for the last kind of 10 years within the kind of marine protected areas, from fishery surveys. So for kind of, again, about 10 years, the local fishermen, when they've come to the beach with their catch has been recorded and weighed and things like that. And I'm using that kind of data, and I'm also looking at climate projections and climate data. And I'm thinking about where within the system is the vulnerabilities to climate change, and what does that look like now? So at the present time, where is the community most vulnerable to the coral bleaching and the disturbances by the tropical cyclones? So I'm looking at the climate projections, and I'm thinking, if the world warms by 1.5 degrees, what will that look like for that specific region of Madagascar? So I'm using high resolution climate projections. By high resolution, I mean where we can look at quite a kind of relatively small area of the Earth and kind of try and predict what the future climate will look like. So if the world warms by 1.5 degrees, how will the climate change impacts on those communities change? And if the world warms by 2 degrees, how the impacts on those communities change? And hopefully through that kind of assessment, we call it a vulnerability assessment, we'll kind of see where maybe weaknesses in the systems lie. And hopefully we can kind of support and advise the local communities, NGO partners, the national government, where's best to invest and plan and help those communities adapt for the climate change.
It sounds like a great way to kind of secure those communities by trying to predict these things.
Yeah, it's important because these communities are literally living kind of hand to mouth with the ocean. 85% of them, the people within the Valenjoki region where I work, are reliant on the fish for their food and their income. So, you know, if the fish disappear, if they can't go out fishing because of, you know, more intense cyclones, anything that disturbs that ecosystem makes them really vulnerable, and in the end it might mean that they have to leave. That's going to kind of be the end result, is that they have to leave that area. And so that's just, obviously I'm just looking at Madagascar, but that kind of issue is relevant for, you know, hundreds of thousands of people all around the Western Indian Ocean and kind of tropical regions.
Yeah, we're not just talking food security, it's a loss of a culture and community.
Yeah.
Was it with Blue Ventures you did a trip to do some sea cucumber farming?
Yeah, so in the summer of 2019, I was part of a research trip with the University of Edinburgh and Blue Ventures, and we were working on a project that they have on sea cucumber aquaculture. In Madagascar, where the sea cucumber aquaculture farms are being developed, sea cucumbers were once really common. They're quite valuable, and so they were completely fished out by the local communities, and they're sold to the East Asian market. I think mostly kind of China, because they're seen as a very like special food. I think that, I'm not sure if I can say this, but they're an aphrodisiac. And so there's a huge demand for them in China. And in Madagascar, they were completely overfished and they basically disappeared from the area that we were working in. And so Blue Ventures started a project where they would actually start sea cucumber farms within the coastal area of the community. And within the community, there are sea cucumber farmers, and they receive the cucumbers when they're tiny little babies, and the sea cucumbers kind of grow up in this farm, and then they are bought back, and they go to the big city, they're dried, and then they're shipped off to China. And the reason that the project was introduced into the communities in Madagascar is it's a method of livelihood diversification. So
the local people sell this, that it's not for eating then?
Yeah, it's supporting income, and it's also removing the pressure from the natural marine ecosystem, and it's giving the locals another form of income. It means that they're not completely reliant on fishing the natural marine populations. It's a sustainable, hopefully long-term method of income.
And was it quite hard to actually get sea cucumber farms to work there? Or because the animals there already, do they just grow quite easily?
So because the species that is used was found quite commonly in the area before they were completely fished, it means that they survive quite well within the coastal area where the farms are.
Did you have to spend a lot of time finding a site that they're already adapted for?
Well, that's actually what our project was doing. We went out there to do some research on, okay, what are the best conditions for the sea cucumber farms? What does the sediment have to look like? How much seagrass should there be? That sort of thing. The kind of outcome of that project was that they produced a toolkit and report that's going to be shared, hopefully, amongst organisations within the Western Indian Ocean to support replication of sea cucumber farms in other places.
So you could do this elsewhere then?
Yeah, as it's seen as a positive method of providing this alternative income for different communities. And unlike other aquaculture, so for example, we're in Scotland, or you might think of salmon aquaculture, it's known to have a pretty bad impact on the ecosystem. Whereas sea cucumber aquaculture doesn't really have a negative impact on the ecosystem. If anything, it has a positive impact on the ecosystem, because sea cucumbers are kind of natural bioturbators. So they eat the sediment and they poo it out, and they mix it all up, and they add nutrients to the area, and they bring more life to the area where they're growing and promote growth.
That's interesting when you think a lot of fish farming is damaging, really.
Yeah, super interesting. I didn't ever think that I would work on sea cucumbers research, but it was pretty fun.
I noticed as well that you worked a little bit on coral or Climatefugia. Could you explain a little bit about what that is?
Sure. In a general sense, Climatefugia for any species is an area where, due to kind of environmental conditions, the species is more likely to be able to kind of persist and survive under kind of changing environmental conditions caused by climate change. And the idea is that in these areas, species can survive, and then maybe in the longer term, it's somewhere where the species can then move out from to repopulate the other areas that the other species may have been lost. So in the terms of specific context of coral, there's a lot of different factors which go into refugia. The main factor that I was looking at was sea surface temperature, because at the moment that is the kind of largest cause of coral decline. So sea surface temperature increase is causing coral bleaching, which is kind of when the algae, which lives within the coral animal, is expelled due to a kind of stress reaction. This isn't necessarily always bad. It's actually something that has always happened and kind of does happen naturally, and it's kind of almost a survival technique for the corals. But as the sea surface temperature is increasing, this is happening kind of again and again every year. And in between these bleaching events, the coral isn't having time to recover.
This might be something completely different, but is ocean acidification the same thing or related, or is it something else entirely?
Yeah, so it's to do with coral bleaching. So definitely ocean acidification is going to become another important threat to corals, and probably is now, but there's definitely kind of a lot less known about it. And it's not seen as one of the kind of key causes of coral decline at the moment. So that's kind of sea surface temperature. And then also on top of that, the kind of human pressures. So the fishing and the coastal development, which is causing kind of lots of pollution and sediment around the corals and that sort of thing. When the corals are alive, they're what we call very kind of topographically complex. So they have lots of kind of holes and they have a big complicated structure which fish can live in. So lots of different fish live in different parts of the reef. But when the reef bleaches, and if then that bleaching turns to kind of what we call coral mortality, when the coral dies, then eventually that kind of structure of the reef is flattened over time, particularly, for example, with an increase in cyclones, and that means the fish have nowhere to live. When there's nowhere for the fish to live, the fish disappear, and then there's no longer there's a lot less fish for the local communities to catch when they're out fishing. And so that's one of the main things that I look at, the kind of link between climate change and what we call small-scale fishing communities.
So sticking on the topic of coral refugia, I think from your website, it looked like you'd done a project actually focused in coral refugia.
The work I have done kind of specifically in coral refugia, I actually started in my master's, and I was asked to do a project on the corals at some islands that are located kind of about 300 miles off the west coast of Mexico. And they're called the Refugia Islands, which is very scary to say.
Do you speak any Spanish?
I don't speak. No, I try to speak Spanish, but the pronunciation of the Refugia Islands took a lot of practice.
Yeah, it convinced me you could speak it.
Yeah. So I was asked to do a project at these islands, and when I came to do the project, I realised very little was known about these corals. So there were some papers published about them kind of in the early 1990s and one in the early 2000s, but that was really just the kind of identification of the species that were there. There was no information on if these corals bleach. There was no information if how healthy the corals were. But the more I looked into it, the more I realized this is a really interesting location. It has the most species out of any kind of coral population in that whole oceanic region. What I found when I started kind of looking into it was that through environmental temperature loggers that had been put around the islands, they'd been put there for 10 months. And once you put them in for 10 months, you leave them, you get them back and you plug them into the computer, and then basically these temperature loggers have taken measurements kind of every 15 minutes. So you can imagine there's thousands and thousands of recordings. But we saw a really interesting pattern. It was that these corals weren't surviving in kind of the normal conditions that you think corals survive. You think corals are kind of living these kind of very clear, kind of almost stable conditions where temperatures will only fluctuate, a couple of degrees per year even. But these corals are surviving in an area where it had temperature fluctuations of up to kind of 7 degrees per day.
A lot more than the 1.5 or 2 degrees you were looking at before.
Yeah. And sometimes, most of the time, kind of 3 to 4 degrees per day, but sometimes up to 7 degrees per day. And this was really interesting because corals aren't sort of kind of living in these conditions. We found kind of lots of studies that had demonstrated that corals that did survive in kind of these high frequency temperature variations have actually been shown to be more resistant to bleaching. And so that's kind of when we first started thinking, this could be maybe an area of climate refugia for corals. because these corals seem very healthy.
So is it likely that experiencing all this temperature change just made those corals evolve like that?
So there's kind of lots of factors that feed into the climate refugia at these islands. So one of them is definitely the temperature variability. Another one is the fact that another kind of very big one is the fact that the islands are completely uninhabited. So there's no human pressures on them. So there's no pressure from coastal development. There's no overfishing because it's a marine protected area. And then another factor that we found that kind of fed into this refugia is the fact that a third of the coral species at the islands were only found at those islands, what's called an endemic species. And so that shows that, for example, if all the corals in all the islands and on the Mexican mainland, if they all disappeared, then maybe this population would be able to self-sustain, because the species that are only found there are obviously kind of reproducing and settling within those islands. But then on the other side of the coin, looking at oceanic current models and things like that, you see that these islands are actually a really important link between the Mexican Pacific and the Indian Pacific, and between the oceanic islands within this ocean region. Looking back at the kind of when I explained what climate refugia was, that it could be potentially an area that in the long run species expand out from. The fact that these islands are kind of connected to different places, the species that are surviving there under the kind of future climate conditions could potentially use those currents to spread out to different areas.
Would it be possible to transplant them to other locations that had lost coral?
So coral transplantation is definitely something that lots of people think about. I don't think we're ready to do that yet, because corals cover kind of thousands of kilometers of ocean. And so to kind of it's almost kind of like, where do you start with coral transplantation and remove and taking those kind of corals that may be more likely to survive? Where do you start putting them around the world? So although it's being done, I'm not sure kind of in that situation where you would start, but that would be a really good experiment, would be to take corals from those islands and put them elsewhere and see how they survive.
Could be another project in the future.
Yeah, maybe you've just given me my next research question.
I'll take credit, but I'd have no idea what to do with them. Well, it's been great to hear all about the work that you've been doing. As a final question, how much of your time do you actually spend on these far-off projects in different countries?
Some people tend to assume that I spend a lot of time on boats or a lot of time on beaches or under the water. Whereas I would say 99% of the time I'm in front of a computer and I'm looking at spreadsheets and I'm writing reports.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the SciFeed Guest Show, and if you want to hear more, subscribe to us using your podcast provider or check out our website scifeed.co.uk. You can also find us on Twitter and Facebook by searching for SciFeed Podcast.